Like this disaster in Australia, where miscalculations led to catastrophic failure.
I heard the biggest crack I've ever heard in my life. It was just like a bomb going off.
A bridge tragedy that rocked an entire city.
The whole of Melbourne was in shock. In the blink of an eye, it's come down. She just could not believe it had happened.
And left a nation asking questions.
I was just horrified. What happened? How did this happen?
Melbourne, with a population of around 5 million, is Australia's fastest growing city. The River Yarra, which splits the city, has played a pivotal role in its success. Ken McInnes is a local historian and engineer.
Melbourne is one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. It has a huge diversity, a huge entertainment culture, arts culture, sports centre of the world. Without the Yarra River, there'd be no Melbourne. It provides water from the upper catchments, and then the lower reaches, where it's south of Delta, it provides support for Melbourne.
In 1978, this epic Yarra crossing opened to traffic. The West Gate Bridge. When built, the 336-metre central span was the longest cable-stayed span in the world.
Construction of the Westgate Bridge started in 1968. As a young civil engineer, I was very excited that this major structure was being built in Melbourne because it was the beginning of the mega structures, the large bridges at the bleeding edge of design.
As a budding engineer in 1970, Ken even visited the construction site and documented his trip.
That's span 10 and 11. And you can see the stage of the concrete construction on the temporary forward being lifted into place on the last two spans here, the central core of the bridge on the western side. There's a shot of spans from Pier 14 to Pier 15. So you can see the sort of construction. The workers' sheds are on the top of the bridge, and you can see how the derrick is then lifting the pieces into place.
Key to this mammoth bridge's strength was a tried-and-true technique dating from the 1850s, which would allow traffic to drive along hollow steel sections known as box girders.
A box girder bridge is a box. It simply is just a box which is continuous, and the box itself then spans from the pier to the pier, and it forms a tube which is strong.
The simplest way to build a bridge like this is to make individual boxes on the ground, then lift them into place, using temporary structures to support the load. Then repeat the process until the bridge meets in the middle. But this wasn't just any bridge.
With this bridge, because of the size and the weight of the boxes, the decision that was made was to build half of the boxes, assemble them on the ground, then jack them to the top of the piers, then roll them across into the structure, and then hope that the two longitudinal sections would join together.
Box girder bridges are always built in sections, and normally it's only the ends that have to meet. But here, because each span was split lengthways too, there was a lot more lining up to do.
Construction took place simultaneously on both sides of the river. Each half, weighing around 600 tons, would be hoisted into place, then bolted together using steel plates or flanges. Tommy Watson was a 22-year-old steel rigger when he landed a job working on the massive project.
It was the biggest job going in I think, the whole of Australia when it first started. There was at least 3,000 people working on the job, and it was a good job for camaraderie and people working together. I was pretty proud to be working on the West Gate.
On October the 15th, 1970, 2 years into construction, Tommy and the team were working on the western side of the bridge, between piers 10 and 11.
That day was a Thursday, which in them days was payday, and everybody was excited. And we were transporting steel across, and I was working down the bottom, getting ready for lunch.
Up on deck, workers were preparing to attach the two half boxes that would form the span.
It was 10 to 12. Some people were on the toilet, some people were washing their hands, some people were in the lunchroom. I just turned around and I heard the biggest crack I've ever heard in my life, and I looked up and the whole lot just came down 100 metres from me.
With workers still on top, the entire 111-metre span between piers 10 and 11 collapsed.
You could see the bridge actually snapping in the centre. You could see bolts coming off. The concrete piling was cracking.
Around 2,000 tonnes of metal and concrete crashed to the ground and into the water.
I've probably seen 5 of my workmates either fall or jump off the bridge on the way down, and then an almighty thud just hit the ground.
They had shelters for the workers under the bridge. Some of those were squashed. People were thrown off the bridge, and the disaster happened.
The impact shook buildings hundreds of metres from the disaster, and the noise was heard around 20 kilometres away.
I just ran towards the bridge and it was just chaos. You realise that your workmates, the people who are friends of yours, were in that structure somewhere. I've never been in a war zone, but it's probably the closest I've ever been.
The catastrophe sent shockwaves across Melbourne. Local resident and construction worker Danny Gardner soon heard the devastating news.
You could not believe it. It was an absolute disaster. A lot of the people lived around here. You know, we knew who they were. And when you see that sort of tragedy happening, it was absolutely, can't put it to words.
This was the worst construction disaster in Australia's history. 18 workers were injured, and tragically, 35 lost their lives.
No, it was terrible. It was just something that came out of the blue, and it happened so quickly. And those sort of things, they just never leave you. You think about them all the time.
The tragedy left the nation in mourning. A royal commission was set up to investigate just what had gone wrong, and in August 1971 released its report. No blame was attributed to any one party, but the reasons behind the tragedy ranged from mistakes to miscalculations, errors of judgment, and failures of communication. Ken visited the site 2 months before the collapse.
I asked the engineer who was giving me a tour whether I could go up on the steel section, and he said, no, we've got some problems. So already I was a little bit horrified. To me, to build a box girder in 2 longitudinal halves and hope that the flanges would join at the top, you just wonder what people were thinking.
When the 2 halves of the span were rolled into position, ready to be joined, workers discovered that they were out of line by more than 11 centimetres.
Part of the problem was to try and get them to join. So they needed to tweak the boxes to try and get them to join together.
When you're talking about huge steel spans that are well over 100 meters long, 11.5 centimeters might not sound like much, but in engineering terms, it's huge. These girders had to line up.
To realign the girders, the decision was made to weigh them down with 7 8-ton concrete blocks. But the extra weight caused the steel to buckle.
The steel just wouldn't go back to the position it was. And the concrete blocks really, they didn't work, so we pulled them all down and sent them away on trucks.
One of the solutions that was made was to tweak a couple of bolts to get a little bit of flexure in the boxes themselves.
To try to straighten the buckle, 30 bolts that held the girders in place were loosened and removed.
I took the bolts out, and the bridge bent and collapsed, and having started to fall, the end of the bridge over the river then knocked down the pier as well.
Because the steel was under so much tension, it just snapped. I found out later that the steel had turned blue. They lost the holes. They're trying to put the bolts back in the holes.
In 1972, construction resumed, with many of the surviving workers returning to finish the job, Tommy included.
I started the job, I wanted to finish it. My mates got killed on a project. that wasn't completed, and I wanted to complete the job for them too. The job had to be completed for the memory of the 35.
The steelwork was strengthened, temporary piers put in place, and based on calculations, this time no more than 2 bolts would be removed at any one time. Danny Gardner joined the rebuild as a rigger.
I am absolutely proud of working on the Westgate Bridge. I'm proud to be part of an iconic structure in Australia. A lot of our construction men who were killed in it were friends of ours. And that was a sense of finishing a job that unfortunately some of our friends' fathers couldn't finish.
More than 40 years later, the West Gate still stands proud as a vital crossing for the city and a memorial to the workers who tragically lost their lives.
When I go over the bridge, I think about them all the time, and you end up in a traffic jam and the traffic stopped, and you sit on the actual section that's collapsed. And that's the time I really think about the people's names.
My view of looking at the Westgate Bridge even today, standing here, I treat it as a monument of the men who were killed that fateful day. And if you look at it, it's a monument to them.